Thank you for inviting me to speak in this session. And also, thanks for still figuring out ways to make this possible, even with what's going on right now in the world. Today, I would like to talk to you about work that we're doing as part of the Advanced Geo Partnership Project. My name is Asmard Asafal Berhe. I'm one of the co-PIs in the project, along with the list of authors that you see on the screen. And today I want to specifically talk to you about empowering geoscientists to improve diversity and inclusion in our scientific field. And I'm going to give some general observations about trends that exist in our community right now, and then draw on our experience from the Advanced Geo program to promote institutional and cultural change. Start by highlighting that the issue of lack of diversity in the geosciences is a persistent one. Here I'm showing you data from NSF survey of earned directorates that basically shows that the number of PhD recipients in the US that identified as either Hispanic, Latino, or Black or African American has remained roughly the same at about 5 to 6%, and then the proportion of PhD recipients that identified as American Indian or Alaska Native has remained less than 1% since 2009. And if you zoom in into the geosciences in the 2018 data set that's now available online, you notice that 80% of the PhD recipients identified as white, and very small proportions identified as being members of these underrepresented groups. To highlight how dire this problem is, in this box on your right, I have actually given the actual number of people that from these groups that actually received PhDs in 2018. Only 11 Black people received PhDs in geosciences. And remember, this is across wide areas of earth, ocean, and atmospheric sciences that I've listed at the bottom here. Only 3 of PhD recipients in the areas of geoscience identified as American Indian, Alaska Native, and about 49 as Hispanic or Latino. So this problem is dire and is also persisted for long period of time. The issue of persistent lack of diversity in the geosciences is even more dire when we look at the data on women, and especially women of color, where women make up a very small proportion of faculty in geoscience departments across academic institutions in the US. Typically less than 20% overall for women and less than 7% for women of color across wide fields of earth, atmospheric, and oceanic sciences. And the other important trend that shows up in the data is that there's significant attrition of women at every stage in their careers. This persistent problem of lack of diversity in the geosciences was very nicely articulated in a paper in Nature Geosciences in 2018, where you see that with multiple efforts that went into diversifying academic programs over 4 decades, there's been very little to no change in diversity of who's receiving PhDs and who's occupying higher ranks in geoscience fields across the country, even after 40 years. It's important to note that many geoscience departments, even today, still have no faculty or students of color, in particular women of color. Narrative that's often told to explain away this persistent lack of diversity in the geosciences is that there just aren't enough members of underrepresented groups to recruit or even retain in academic institutions. The president of Pomona College, Dr. Starr, gave a poignant response to Purdue's president when he referred to Black scholars as rare creatures in one of these efforts to explain away lack of diversity. And she stated that this idea that scholars of color are rare is a damaging fiction that is unfortunately common in academic circles, though it's continuously repeated by academic administrators and used as an excuse to not pursue people of color in particular. And obviously, this has multiple consequences because it not only can perpetuates this persistent lack of diversity, but it even makes younger scholars think that it's impossible to ever lead in this community, right? It has the consequence of leading to loss of creativity, delayed discoveries, and fewer transformative ideas that the world desperately needs right now. And of course, it helps maintain the status quo because it it negates or ignores the fact that scholars from underrepresented groups are intentionally minoritized by the structures that are inherent in academic institutions. I need to note here that our academic institutions are set up with institutional structures, practices, behaviors that continue to exclude certain segment of society. Our institutions are built on long legacies of patriarchal or colonial systems that were intentionally set up to exclude certain segment of society, in particular women and people of color. And so the history of how our institutions were set up and who was allowed to have an influence in our academic communities were people that look like those on these relatively old pictures that you see on the screen. And this is true for both field based geosciences, for example, as well as lab based fields in the geosciences. Even many years after these pictures were taken, you would still be hard pressed to find a very inclusive and diverse field of geosciences that is diverse, representative, and inclusive in not just how in representation of members of different communities, but also in terms of the power structures that set up the culture and set the standards for how we conduct ourselves in this academic community. Times when this persistent lack of diversity in academic fields and institutions is discussed, a lot of folks invoke this idea of a leaky pipeline to explain how there is significant attrition at every career stage for women and people of color in general. And I have a bit of a problem with this metaphor because it portrays this issue as this passive loss of people that that are members of underrepresented groups or women from the academic community, just because they can't make it or because they're not interested in this field. And it ignores the fact that when women in underrepresented communities enter our field, they tend to experience considerable lack of support, bias, harassment, and discrimination, which I think is more accurately represented by a vicious obstacle course metaphor than it is by a leaky pipeline metaphor. A lot of published research over the last few decades has explained how the playing field is not level when it comes to women and underrepresented groups in STEM fields, but academic and scholarly work in general, as the existing biases and discriminations in community in general manifest as inequities at pretty much every level of scholarly education and fields. It shows up in how students are mentored differently depending on their race, gender, shows up in terms of how job applications are evaluated, reference letters are written and evaluated, how we decide salary scales and startup costs for folks entering academic institutions in terms of who gets access to research facilities, who gets invitations to be referees for journal articles or proposals, who gets speaking invitations and awards, who even gets nominated for those awards, who gets named professorships, and who's doing the invisible labor that does not get due recognition in academic institutions, for example. And the same patterns are observed also when you look at data on who's publishing and recognized with prestigious publications. Um, and important here to remind folks that the citations that are colored in blue are all citations from fields that are in geosciences, so they're very specific to our community. When we talk about this vicious obstacle course for women and underrepresented folks, I think it's important to remember that the path is complicated at multiple levels, and there is
The Advanced Geo Partnership is a national partnership that's funded by the National Science Foundation and includes researchers from across the US, including researchers from large, primarily white institutions and minority serving institutions, including both public and private schools, as well as large R1 schools and all the way to small liberal arts schools. All of these researchers are working in partnership with professional associations, in particular the Earth Science Women's Network, the Association of Women Geoscientists, and the American Geophysical Union, again in partnership to empower geoscientists to be able to transform workplace climate and improve equity, diversity, and inclusion across all areas of geosciences.